For this week's Big Train Tour, we're going to be taking a look at an idler car. Built for the Denver and Rio Grande Western in 1943, this short, standard gauge, flat car-like contraption is another one of those little-known, full-sized railroad cars preserved here at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, the Executive Director here at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today we're touring idler car X3050. If we can compare an idler car to a catalyst, what does this mean? Well, idler cars in railroading are necessary to make certain shipments possible, even though they themselves do not actually do the carrying. In the case of idler car X3050, this car was built specifically to enable dual gauge trains to operate on the Denver and Rio Grande system. Think about it. A dual gauge train? That means that cars with two different track gauges are being hauled in the same train. That seems odd, doesn't it? Well, not really. At several different locations along the Denver and Rio Grande routes, at certain times in its history, various sections of trackage were dual gauged, at least for a time. The San Luis Valley was unique in that its dual gauge trackage remained in place until the very end of Colorado narrow gauge railroading in the late 1960s. In the San Luis Valley, the history of the Rio Grande's development played a special role in this dual gauge saga. While the railroad pushed its narrow gauge transcontinental route west out of Pueblo and up through the Royal Gorge towards Gunnison and Montrose, it was also expanding to the south. It pushed a new route over La Veta Pass in 1876, reaching Alamosa in 1878, and then continuing south to Antonito and west to Chama and Durango by 1881. This 3-foot narrow gauge railroad route was known as the San Juan Extension. Another line ran south out of Antonito to Santa Fe, New Mexico. By the late 1880s, the Denver and Rio Grande saw the need to convert its major routes to standard gauge if it was going to remain competitive with rivals. The costs and hassles of transloading, having to transfer the cargo on each narrow gauge car to standard gauge and vice versa, were just too great. The railroad's line from Denver along the Front Range south to Pueblo and El Moro near Trinidad was standard gauged, and the line over La Veta Pass to Alamosa was also standard gauged as well in 1899. Plans were made to standard gauge all the way to Durango, but this never happened. Alamosa became a major junction point with a roundhouse and servicing facility for narrow gauge locomotives and cars, and the center of the Rio Grande's narrow gauge railroad operations. To the north, the narrow gauge continued over Poncha Pass and then headed west on the railroad's original main line via Marshall Pass to Gunnison, Montrose, and Grand Junction. Dual gauge trackage extended south out of Alamosa to Antonito. Another dual gauge line ran north to Leadville from Salida along a portion of the Rio Grande's Royal Gorge, Tennessee Pass main line. To save on train crews and equipment, the Rio Grande would put together trains with cars of both track gauges for movement in the valley. This curious idler car was the point in the train where the transition between cars of two different track gauges would occur. So how does this car work? Well, let's start by taking a look at the arrangement of the couplers. You've got a standard gauge coupler here in the middle. It's higher and in the center. Standard gauge cars are higher at the buffer. You've got this narrow gauge coupler. Now there's nothing different about that coupler, but it is lower and off to the side because narrow gauge cars are shorter, and because the third rail offsets them to the side, you had to be able to pull through the car at this kind of odd angle. If this rail were offset to the other side, the train crew would have to take out a big pin, disconnect these pins, pick up the coupler, move it into this pocket here, and then reassemble it but you can literally set this up to pull narrow gauge in either side of the third rail setup, and then standard gauge on one end of the car or the other. So it's the same way on the other end of the car. If you're not familiar with how narrow and standard gauge rails work in combination, here's a quick recap. Typically the third rail in a narrow gauge setup is offset to one side. Both the standard and narrow gauge share a common rail on the other side. Complications do arise when you get to track switches and other special tracking. The most fascinating place to take a look at this whole situation is around a roundhouse and turntable. Here at the Colorado Railroad Museum, you can see how narrow gauge trains transition from a third rail arrangement to a centered four rail situation when approaching our turntable. Think about it. If it didn't do this, when the turntable would rotate 180 degrees, where would the third rail line up on the other side? Okay, so back to our idler car. This must have been an interesting car to watch in service. Just imagine the crew having to sort out which place the coupler's going to go on the narrow gauge end, coupling it up to standard gauge cars on the other end, and then once you get the train about ready to get started, air hoses all coupled up and everything, imagine the pulling forces going through this car, because when you start on one end it's centered, the standard gauge, and then it's kind of off to one side, and so the car probably tended to rack a little bit in service. That must have been an interesting thing to watch as well. The buffer and draft forces would have been interesting as well, because you've got larger standard gauge cars, probably those went towards the front, and then smaller narrow gauge cars behind that were built out of wood. This car served until the very end of narrow gauge service in the 1960s before coming to the museum. The term idler car applies to other railroad cars too. In particular, when the cargo being carried is longer than available flat cars, then an idler flat car must be employed, usually on either end of the main cargo car, to space out the cargo and provide overlap. This can be the case for a number of oversized cargoes. On the narrow gauge Denver and Rio Grande Western, a number of idler cars were built out of older cut-down boxcars in the 1950s to help with the oil and gas boom in the Farmington, New Mexico area. These cars were used to provide space between long lengths of steel pipe which were being hauled into Farmington. The museum has preserved Rio Grande idler flat car number 6732, which was built in 1955 and today serves as an open outdoor passenger car when trains are run here at the museum. Notice the length of rail upside down on the underframe, which was added by the railroad to provide additional strength lost in the cutting down of the old previous boxcar. Even today, idler cars can be found at work on America's railroads. Long, slim cargoes, such as wind turbine blades and aircraft wing assemblies, are often longer than the longest railroad cars, which are about 85 feet in length. So, these cargoes hang over idler cars on both ends. Unusual cargoes like this require special handling by railroads to ensure that these cargoes do not overhang too far on sharp curves where they could strike other trains. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed learning about another unique type of railroad car, the idler. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
If you enjoy our content, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Sharing and commenting in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.